Get her off my ship. Captain Vecton Ross spat the words through clenched mandibles, his exoskeletal fingers tightening around the command panel as he glared at the containment chamber. The reinforced cell pulsed with containment fields, their low flicker casting sharp shadows against the metallic walls. Inside, motionless, sat the reason for his growing unease. A human woman. She had been silent since they dragged her aboard, wrists bound in containment cuffs, her expression unreadable. Unlike other captives, there had been no struggle, no desperate pleas or threats. She walked onto his vessel as if she had been expecting this moment. Ross despised her silence more than anything. It was unnatural. Humans screamed when they were afraid. They cursed, they fought. But this one, the soft rasp of boots against the deck signaled the arrival of his subordinates. Two enforcers in plated armor flanked the High Chancellor's envoy, Zarin Kleck, an aging, brittle-framed scholar whose sunken eyes betrayed a lifetime spent hunched over research terminals rather than battlefields. He looked at the woman the way one might study a venomous creature behind glass, equal parts curiosity and caution. "She doesn't belong here," Ross muttered, his throat clicking as he watched Kleck approach the chamber. "This is a military vessel, not some research lab." Kleck barely acknowledged him. His focus was locked on the human, his claws tapping thoughtfully against the datapad in his grasp. "You intercepted a high-priority transport," he murmured, voice dry as parchment. "Do you truly believe she's a mere civilian? She surrendered without a fight." Ross's mandibles twitched. "That alone is suspicious." For the first time since being captured, the woman looked up. It was a small thing, a shift of gaze so unremarkable that it shouldn't have raised the hairs along the back of his neck. But there was something in her stare, something measured, something aware. She was watching them. Waiting. Kleck straightened, expression unreadable. "High Chancellor Ovrak is expecting her immediately." "We leave now," Ross hesitated. Every instinct screamed that handing her over was a mistake. But orders were orders. "Take her." The chamber hissed open, and the moment the restraints deactivated, she rose smoothly, not with the stiffness of someone held captive, not with the sluggishness of fear, but with purpose, as if she had been waiting for the door to open. Neither the guards nor Kleck noticed it, but Ross did, and it chilled him more than the void itself. High Chancellor Ovrak sat within the grand central chamber of the Galactic Council, a monolithic construct of polished stone and metal that loomed over the capital world's skyline like an unshakable monument to power. From the tinted observation panels, the view stretched beyond the endless cityscape, lights pulsating like the slow, rhythmic breath of a sleeping giant. Power, control, order. This was the heart of civilization, and now within its core stood the prisoner. Ovrak steepled his elongated fingers, tapping them once against the marble table as the guards dragged the human forward. A dozen representatives watched from the circular tiered seating, their collective murmurs barely concealed beneath the weight of their arrogance. She had no right to stand here, a human, surrounded by the finest minds of the galaxy, a creature from a species barely elevated from their own primal chaos. Yet she didn't kneel, she didn't speak, she didn't flinch. Ovrak's mouth curled slightly, the closest his species could manage to a smirk. "You are Lauder Oteth," he said, leaning forward. The woman said nothing. Kleck cleared his throat beside him. "Her identification matches. But there are irregularities." Ovrak's eyes flickered. "Irregularities?" Kleck hesitated, his thin fingers twitching over the datapad. "Her neural scans are incomplete. There is interference, something disrupting our readings. Biologically, she appears human, but her vital patterns fluctuate." Ovrak frowned. "Explain." Kleck shifted uncomfortably. "I can't." That was unacceptable. Ovrak turned his gaze back to the woman. "Are you a soldier?" No answer. "Are you a spy?" Silence. His patience thinned. "If you believe silence protects you, you are mistaken. You are alone. Your species is an isolated world at the edge of civilization, and we have seized you without resistance." He leaned closer, voice taking on a condescending edge. "You are nothing. Speak before I strip the words from you." That was when she smiled. Small, measured, deliberate. And then she spoke for the first time. "You shouldn't have done that." The words were soft, almost lost beneath the towering silence of the chamber, but something in them struck deep. a weight far greater than the sum of syllables. Ovrak felt it first, a cold, creeping sensation beneath his skin. Klek went rigid beside him. The chamber darkened for a fraction of a second, an impossible flicker of disruption in a place built to withstand every contingency. Then the alarms began. Short, sharp bursts of warning sirens shattered the chamber's composure. Red emergency displays rippled across the interfaces, scrolling endless streams of incomprehensible failures. Ovrak whirled to the nearest console. "What is happening?" A technician's voice, shaking, answered through the intercom. "Chancellor, there's an unauthorized transmission from the containment level. We're trying to." The screens glitched. For a breathless instant, all displays went black. Then new data flooded in, not in the structured, orderly readouts of the Council's familiar systems, but something else, something alien. But Aegis protocol, active. Ovrak's throat went dry. That wasn't Council code. That wasn't their system. That was... He turned slowly back to the human woman. She was still smiling. Klek took a stumbling step back. "Shut it down," he rasped. "Shut it down now." The command center did not respond. Lautaro tilted her head, watching them with something that wasn't quite amusement, something colder, something more knowing. Ovrak's breath came sharp and unsteady. "What have you done?" Lautaro exhaled slowly, her gaze lifting toward the central display as a final message etched itself across the screen. Signal transmitted. Aegis protocol engaged. And then, in the kind of voice that wasn't a threat, but a statement of inevitable truth, she murmured, "It's too late." The chamber plunged into chaos. The chamber convulsed with sound, alarms shrieking, static crackling from disabled terminals, overlapping voices twisted in confusion. Red emergency lights cast frantic shadows across the polished walls, distorting the once majestic insignia of the Galactic Council into fragmented shapes that wavered like ghosts. High Chancellor Ovrak stood rigid, his three-fingered hands gripping the console as if sheer force could reverse what had just unfolded before him. The display in front of him pulsed with a message that had no right to exist here. Aegis protocol, active. It was not of Council origin. It did not belong to them. He turned, throat dry. The human woman still stood in the center of the chamber, her posture unbothered by the rising chaos, a figure untouched by the storm she had conjured. Guards closed in, weapons raised. "What did you do?" Ovrak demanded, his voice raw. Leroy Teth simply tilted her head, studying the growing panic as though she were watching an experiment reach its inevitable conclusion. "I didn't do anything," she said. "You did." Klek's fingers shook over his datapad as he tried, and failed to purge the transmission from their systems. "This shouldn't be possible," he hissed, sweat glistening along the creases of his brow. "Our security is impenetrable. Our firewalls..." "Your firewalls," Leroy interrupted, voice even, "have already been rewritten." Ovrak's mind churned. No human technology should have been able to infiltrate Council mainframes, and yet the proof glowed in front of him, undeniable and absolute. The Council's entire network had been breached. Panic rippled through the room. Technicians slammed their hands against panels that no longer obeyed. Defense officers barked into dead comms, issuing orders into the void. Klek's voice pitched higher. "Shut down the relays, isolate the core." A desperate attempt at containment. A futile effort to undo something they had never understood in the first place. Because the message wasn't merely sent, it had been received. Ovrak's mind raced as he followed the horror playing out across his screens. The signal was moving beyond their planetary network, spreading in silent waves through their encrypted relays, bypassing firewalls as though they were nothing more than paper walls in a hurricane. Then a new warning flared across the consoles. Long-range detection grid, offlane. His chest tightened. The only reason that system would fail was if something was already inside their borders. Leroy Teth had not come alone. A cold, undeniable realization coiled in Ovrak's gut. She had never been a captive. She had been the trigger. The first soldier reached her, swinging his rifle butt toward her ribs. The moment it should have connected, she moved. A blur. Not enhanced, not augmented. Just one step ahead. The strike met empty air, and in the same breath she turned the mistake against him. A single pivot, a sharp twist of his wrist, a cry of pain. The rifle was hers now. The next soldier stepped forward. She fired. The shot slammed into the deck beside his boot, sending splintered heat into the air. The warning shot froze them all. She never aimed to kill. She didn't have to. Ovrak's hands curled into fists. "Stand down," he ordered, through clenched teeth. His own words tasted like defeat. The guards hesitated, shifting uneasily as Leora lifted the weapon, only to casually toss it aside, letting it clatter to the floor. She never needed it. She had already won. The silence after was somehow worse than the chaos before it. Ovrak inhaled, trying to still the tremor in his pulse. "Tell me what you activated," he demanded. Leora considered him for a moment, then walked forward, not rushed, not threatened, but with the same unshaken confidence she had carried since the moment she arrived. She stopped just within arm's reach, far too close. Ovrak held his ground, then she leaned in, just enough for her next words to be spoken low. "It's already here." A pulse of static shuddered through the air. Every screen in the chamber cut to black. No alarms, no data, no sound except the breath of unease spreading through every official in the room. Then, one by one, the systems flickered back to life, not with the Council's interface, with Earth's. The Galactic Council's command hub had been overwritten. The capital of their empire was no longer theirs to control. Ovrak stared as a new display appeared at the heart of the room. A transmission feed, live, from deep space. It was grainy at first, but then it clarified, showing a view from one of their remaining active satellites. It should have been empty. Instead it was filled with shadows. No, not shadows. Ships, silent, motionless, waiting, but not Council vessels. Human warships, dozens, no signatures, no broadcasts. Their presence undetected until now, as if they had simply stepped out of the void itself. They were already inside Council territory. Ovrak's heart pounded. Impossible. Leora's voice was soft, measured. "It's not." The realization sunk its claws into his mind. They had disabled his detection grid. They had rendered his defenses blind before they ever arrived. And now they were already here. His hands curled tighter. "This is war." Leora didn't blink. "No," she said. "This was your mistake." A new alert rippled across the display. Planetary defense systems, offline. Ovrak's breath caught. The war had already begun, and the Council had lost the first battle without ever firing a shot. The chamber erupted. Military officials scrambled to recover failing systems. Diplomats shouted over each other, their polished veneer of superiority now cracking under the weight of fear. Ovrak did not move. His gaze remained locked on the silent fleet that had somehow breached their borders. How long had they been waiting in the dark? How long had the Council been under watch without knowing? His fingers clenched around the railing, knuckles whitening. Leora Teth stood beside him, watching the panic unfold with the patience of someone who had seen this play out before, because she had. Because this was never a battle, it was an execution, and she had been the one to start it. Ovrak turned his head, slow, deliberate. "What happens next?" Leora met his stare with calm certainty. "You tell yourself you still have a choice," she said, voice low. "You don't." And then the first human warship moved, straight toward them. The first human warship moved. It did not surge forward with the raw aggression of a war beast let loose. It did not open fire in a reckless display of dominance. It simply advanced, slicing through the void with the slow, patient inevitability of a blade being drawn across a throat. Ovrak's hands tightened on the edge of the command console, fingers pressing deep enough to leave indentations on the polished surface. His mind ran through calculations, projections, retaliatory measures, but none of them mattered. The truth drowned every alternative. The Council had no control over this battle. The sleek, angular form of the lead warship slid closer, its darkened hull betraying nothing. No insignia, no transmissions, not a single flicker of artificial light along its ridges. Just a silent silhouette, vast enough to swallow the entire view of the chamber screens. How did they get here? Supreme Fleet Marshal Dreth Vallis's voice cut through the thick atmosphere, his throat clicking through barely restrained rage. His armored shoulders were rigid, posture locked in the brittle defiance of a cornered predator. "No fleet has the capability to enter our space undetected." Leora's gaze never left the screen. "Yours doesn't." Ovrak's breath was shallow, his chest tightening beneath the weight of realization. He had seen wars begin before, declarations, Negotiations, the slow unfurling of conflict across controlled battlefields. This was different. This wasn't the beginning of a war. This was the last moments before a massacre. A static burst fractured the silence as the planetary defense grid attempted to reassert control. The screens flickered, one moment displaying emergency override codes, the next collapsing into encrypted nonsense as the Aegis protocol burrowed deeper. Systems are failing sector by sector, one of the technicians stammered, his hands darting over the console in frantic desperation. We can't re-engage command relays. The fleet is blind. They aren't blind, Kleck interrupted, voice ragged with horror. He swallowed hard, tapping into the tactical network forcing manual access. They can still fire. They just don't know who the enemy is anymore. And as if to confirm his words, another warning flashed across the main screen. Automated targeting systems compromised, weapons recalibrating, the warships floating within the Council's protective border, their own ships, their own armies were no longer pointing outward. They were slowly turning inward. Ovrak felt something drop in his stomach. He had spent decades overseeing military strategies, calculating risks, dismantling uprisings with cold efficiency. But this wasn't an attack. It was a rewiring of reality itself. The human fleet wasn't here to fight. It was here to erase the possibility of resistance. Valis reacted first, slamming a fist against the console, mandibles flaring. We cannot allow this. Activate every remaining fleet. Manually override weapons control and fire. The technician hesitated. Valis turned on him, teeth bared. Did you not hear me? The words barely left his mouth before the nearest planetary defense station vanished. Not in a calculated sequence of explosion patterns. Not in the controlled destruction of a critical strike. 1 second it was there, floating in position just above the Council's planetary capital. The next a crater of expanding debris bloomed in its place. A single strike, no energy surge, no scatter of residual radiation, just raw kinetic obliteration. A planetary-sized object shattered into nothing, and the shockwave rippled through the upper atmosphere like a wound tearing across flesh. For the first time, someone screamed. It wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't a call to arms. It was the sound of realization. The humans were not using energy weapons. They were not wasting power on shields, on intricate tactical maneuvers. They were using brute force physics, relativistic weapons, firing from positions so distant that the projectiles had been traveling for hours before impact. The battle had started long before they ever knew they were at war. Valis stumbled back from the screen. This is genocide. Leora turned, her expression unreadable. No, she said. This is correction. Ovrak's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. This level of calculation, of inevitability. The Council had always believed themselves untouchable. Their fleets outnumbered every empire combined. Their technology had been unrivaled for centuries. They dictated who held power and who remained beneath it. And yet, every ship they had, every fleet they controlled, every weapon they once relied upon, none of it belonged to them anymore. Valis shook his head. We can still. Another station erupted into cascading destruction, the shockwave sending a ripple of distortion through the lower atmosphere. The sky was raining fire. Then the warships finally spoke. A single transmission pulsed through every comms relay, overriding the garbled distress calls, cutting through static like a whispered omen. It was not a declaration of war. It was a message. A simple, undeniable statement, total compliance or total erasure. Ovrak could feel the weight of those words settling into his bones. Leora exhaled, shifting her stance slightly, and for the first time semp in her expression. Not cruelty, not pleasure, inevitability. She had known. She had known exactly how this would play out, from the moment she had let them take her, from the moment she stepped aboard their ship without resistance. This had never been about leverage. This had never been about negotiation. She had walked into their hands and brought the war with her. The screens flickered again, the targeting systems locked, and Ovrak realized he wasn't looking at a fleet preparing to attack. He was looking at a graveyard forming in real time. The war was already over. They just hadn't accepted their deaths yet. Ovrak's hands trembled against the console. His voice felt distant, as if spoken by someone else entirely.
What happens now?
Leora tilted her head slightly. considering the question. Then a new transmission came through, encrypted, untraceable. But there was no doubt who it belonged to. A single voice, calm and weighted, unfurled through the chamber like a final verdict.
You thought she was a prisoner.
She was the executioner. Ovrak's pulse stilled, because that voice didn't belong to Leora Teth. It belonged to the man who had been waiting for this moment since the second they took her. Commander Ranith Voss, and he was already here. The chamber was suffocating in silence. The weight of Ranith Voss's voice still clung to the air, the message sinking into every corner, filling the spaces between desperate heartbeats. High Chancellor Ovrak's grip on the console was white-knuckled, but he could feel the uselessness of it now. The control he had wielded for decades had evaporated, reduced to nothing more than an illusion. He knew that name, Voss, a name spoken in wary tones within military councils, a strategist whose victories were studied but never truly understood. He was never the one leading planetary invasions or parading his fleets in a display of power. No. His was the kind of warfare that did not wait for the battle to begin, because he decided when it had already ended. And now he was here. Another screen flickered to life, this one showing the leading human warship, its surface dark as if it had been carved from shadow itself. Still moving, still silent, still waiting. Valis turned, his breathing shallow. We have to launch an immediate counterattack. If we don't, the main planetary defense grid collapsed. The energy signatures on every remaining orbital station blinked out, their command signals severed before a single countermeasure could be initiated. The entire defensive backbone of the Council's homeworld had been erased as easily as if someone had cut the string of a puppet and watched it crumple. The warship on screen was no longer alone. The transmission feed widened, revealing more. Not dozens, not even hundreds, thousands, not in formation, not preparing to maneuver. They were already aligned for execution. A sharp, uneven breath came from somewhere in the room, but Ovrak couldn't tell who had made it. Kleck stumbled back, his datapad slipping from his hands, hitting the polished floor with a brittle impact. This isn't how wars are fought. His voice was barely above a whisper. This isn't. Leora turned toward him, studying him like an equation already solved. Then you've never truly been in one. The words sent a fresh ripple of tension through the chamber. Valis clenched his fists, jaw tightening. We can still fight. If we direct the remaining planetary defense forces, if we manually engage, fight what? Leora asked. The question shouldn't have been devastating, but it was. Because there was no enemy fleet to attack. The humans had already dismantled their war machine before they could lift a single weapon, but the true nightmare wasn't what had been lost, it was what still remained. Voss's voice crackled through the chamber's speakers once more, cutting through their unraveling thoughts. High Chancellor. Ovrak forced himself to straighten. You think this is victory? He demanded, forcing steel into his voice even as the walls of his control collapsed around him. You think destruction will serve as your legacy? The response was measured, not loud, not aggressive. Worse, that depends on you. Ovrak's stomach nodded. The silence stretched between them, thick and unrelenting. Then new activity on the displays. A single projectile detached from one of the human warships, its trajectory slow, deliberate. No rush, no need. It was descending toward the Council's capital city. A beacon. Not an attack, not yet. Ovrak's heart pounded. His people, billions, were below, watching the sky fracture under the weight of something they had no name for. He turned sharply to Valis. Intercept it. I can't. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't hesitation. It was the truth. Ovrak felt the full weight of those two words slam into him, deeper than any blade. You don't understand, Valis continued, his voice lower now, fraying at the edges. There's nothing left to intercept with. Ovrak could feel his chest tighten, pulse drumming at his temples, the relay stations, the targeting systems, the launch codes for orbital countermeasures. Valis met his gaze, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Ovrak saw it in him. The resignation, the understanding. The moment we captured her, Valis finished, we lost all of it. Leora watched their crumbling realization with the patience of someone who had been waiting for them to finally catch up. Ovrak turned on her, rage slicing through the despair. You think this is justice? You think this is balance? This is annihilation. Laura exhaled slowly, like she had heard this before, like she had been through these conversations 100 times over. I think, she said, this is what happens when you assume the executioner is your hostage. A new signal rippled through the council's remaining frequencies. A single message. From Voss, not to the council. To every world under its rule, it translated across languages in perfect synchronization. A declaration, a warning, a truth. Your leaders assumed their seat of power made them untouchable. They were wrong. Your governments told you the council was unshakable. That was a lie. Look at your skies. Look at your failing cities. Look at the ones you put your trust in, and ask yourselves one question. Is this what strength looks like? Ovrak clenched his jaw, refusing to look at the transmission feeds, refusing to see how many other planetary systems were receiving this broadcast. Voss wasn't talking to him anymore. He was talking to the millions beneath them, and the worst part, the part Ovrak couldn't stop, was that they were listening. He turned back to Laura, fury burning in his veins. If you came to kill me, then do it. She blinked, as if he had misunderstood something fundamental. Then, for the first time since she had stepped into this chamber, her expression shifted. Not anger, not cruelty, something colder, something absolute. You don't get to die yet, she said. Ovrak's breath hitched. The last planetary override collapsed. The beacon reached its target. A wave unfolded over the capital, invisible but absolute. The planet's infrastructure dimmed, not in destruction, but in erasure. The command centers, the emergency failsafes, the entire foundation of the Council's empire, scrubbed clean, not through weapons, through something worse, through irrelevance. Ovrak's throat tightened. They had spent centuries believing that power was defined by what you could destroy, and humanity had just proven that true power was knowing you never had to. Voss's voice came through one last time, measured, calm. Consider this mercy. Then the human warships began to move again, not advancing, leaving. Laura took a slow step back, turning toward the exit, guards no longer daring to stop her. She had done what she came here to do. As she reached the threshold, she paused, looked over her shoulder. Do you know what the worst part is, Chancellor? Ovrak forced himself to meet her stare. She didn't blink. You were never our real enemy. And then she was gone. The chamber sat in frozen horror as the final truth settled over them like a burial shroud. The council hadn't just lost. They no longer mattered. The chamber still echoed with absence. Leora was gone. The human fleet had already begun to withdraw, slipping away like a shadow stretching toward the horizon. They had not claimed planets. They had not raised banners. They had simply come, broken everything, and left. Ovrak had always imagined the end of the council would come in fire and ruin, the kind of war that left behind debris, the kind of destruction that demanded mourning. But this was something far worse. Silence. A world untouched, but hollowed from the inside. His fingers curled over the console, gripping at something that no longer existed. The infrastructure of the entire governing body of the known galaxy vanished without the need for a single invasion force. The Council's enemies had dreamed of burning them down, of storming their halls and raising the banners of conquest. But humanity had simply turned the page. They had made the Council obsolete. That was why the warships were leaving. That was why they hadn't executed him. They didn't need to. The Council was dead in every way that mattered. The weight of realization settled into his chest, cold and suffocating. His gaze drifted over the chamber, once the epicenter of control, now reduced to little more than a room full of people trying to comprehend how the entire foundation of their existence had been dismantled without a single demand. Valis stood near the transmission panel, his posture slumped, eyes locked onto the empty screen where the human fleet had last been displayed. He looked not like a soldier defeated, but a soldier discarded, a relic of a system that no longer had a purpose. Ovrak exhaled sharply. We have to rebuild. His voice was low, controlled, but the room still flinched at the sound of it, as if the very idea of leadership had turned foreign in the last hour. We still have planets under our command. We still... A new transmission interrupted him. It was not from the humans. It was not from any source within the Council's known alliances. The screen flickered, displaying a rotating list of independent planetary signatures, broadcasting in synchronization, hundreds of them. the representatives of every world that had once answered to the Council, and their message was clear. They were leaving, not conquered, not overthrown, leaving, one by one. Planetary governments that had once been under the Council's rule were now announcing their severance. There was no need for revolution, no need for insurrection, because humanity had shown them something they had never considered possible. The Council was not a necessity, it was a choice, and they were no longer making it. A hollow sound left Kleck's throat as his hands trembled over the datapad, scrolling through the cascading wave of declarations. He shook his head, disbelief painted into every movement. They're abandoning us, not abandoning, acknowledging what was already true. Ovrak's vision blurred, his focus tightening to a singular point in the center of the screen. It had taken humanity one act to erase everything the Council had spent centuries building. One war they never truly fought, one signal sent through their own network, one woman walking through their doors and sitting at their table like she had been invited. Voss had not merely defeated them, he had turned them into a warning, a monument to what happens when you mistake power for permanence. Valis finally broke the silence. His voice was different now, lacking the steel that had once shaped it, lacking the fire that had burned beneath his commands. They're not coming back, are they? Ovrak didn't answer. He didn't have to. The future had already been rewritten. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, it no longer mattered what they wanted. They were the artifact left behind. The galaxy would move forward without them. Ovrak's hands slid from the console, resting at his sides, his breath slow, steady, not in acceptance, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. Humanity had not conquered the Council. They had erased the need for one, and the worst part, the part that left an emptiness stretching through his chest, was that they had done it so effortlessly. He lifted his gaze toward the ceiling, as if looking through the steel above him to where the human fleet was already vanishing into the stars. Not invaders, not rulers, just something passing through. Ovrak had always believed the Council would be remembered as an unshakable empire, but now he knew better. They would be remembered as a lesson, and nothing more.